Before we begin our gentle journey back to ancient Rome, I would love it if you could take a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like if you are enjoying the experience. Your support helps me create more of these peaceful historical journeys for you. And please leave a comment below telling me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. It makes our little community feel more connected, knowing that we are all here together, finding peace in the quiet moments of history, no matter where we are in the world or what hour has brought us here. Now, let yourself settle in completely. Find that perfect position where your body can truly let go. Feel the weight of your head sinking into your pillow, your shoulders melting away from your ears, your arms becoming heavy and relaxed at your sides. Take a slow, deep breath in through your nose, feeling the cool air fill your lungs, and then release it slowly through your mouth, letting all the tension of the day flow out with that breath. Let your eyes close gently, as if they are too tired to stay open any longer. Feel the softness of the darkness behind your eyelids, welcoming and warm. Let yourself imagine that you are sitting in a quiet garden courtyard, sheltered from the heat of the day, where a gentle breeze carries the scent of olive trees and the distant sound of trickling water from a marble fountain. The stones beneath you are smooth and cool, worn by countless years, and the air around you feels peaceful and still. Our story today begins in the height of a Roman summer, during those long, languid days when the sun seemed to hang motionless in a sky the color of burnished bronze. It was the time that Romans called the days Caninula, the dog days, when Sirius the dog star rose with the sun and the heat settled over the seven hills like a heavy woolen cloak that could not be removed. In the year we visit, somewhere in the 2nd century after the birth of Christ, the Roman climate optimum held the Mediterranean world in its warm embrace, making summers even more intense than those you might know today. The very air seemed to shimmer with heat that rose from the cobblestones of the Forum, from the terracotta roof tiles of the insulae, from the marble steps of temples where even the gods seemed to drowse in the afternoon sun. In the sprawling city of Rome, home to over 1 million souls, the summer heat was not merely weather, but a living presence that shaped every moment of daily life. The narrow streets between the towering apartment buildings, some rising 6 or 7 stories high, became corridors of stifling air that trapped the warmth like ovens made of stone and brick. The wealthy patricians who could afford it had already fled to their villas in the cooler hills outside the city, or to their seaside retreats along the Bay of Naples, leaving behind a city that moved at the pace of honey dripping from a spoon. Those who remained learned to live by the rhythm of the sun, rising before dawn, when the air still held a whisper of coolness from the night, conducting their business in the pale light of early morning, and then retreating to whatever shade they could find as the sun climbed higher into the relentless blue dome above. The morning would begin with promise, as it always did during the Roman dog days. The first light would creep across the Palatine Hill, touching the marble columns of Augustus' house with fingers of pale gold, and for a brief moment the air would feel almost refreshing. As slaves and servants who tended the great houses would hurry through their outdoor tasks, drawing water from wells and cisterns, sweeping the courtyards, tending to the kitchen gardens where even the hardiest herbs drooped in anticipation of the heat to come. In the poorer districts, families would emerge from their cramped quarters in the insulae, the apartment buildings that housed most of Rome working people. grateful for any breath of air that did not smell of too many bodies living too close together. But as the sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows that seemed to shrink back upon themselves in fear, the true nature of a Roman summer would reveal itself. The heat would begin to rise from the stones, creating an almost visible dance of warm air that made distant buildings waver like mirages. The vendors in the markets would move more slowly, their voices calling out their wares in tones that grew more languid with each passing hour. Fresh fish brought up from Astia, the port city at the mouth of the Tiber, would need to be sold quickly before the heat could spoil them, while fruits and vegetables would begin to wilt despite the seller's best efforts to keep them in whatever shade they could improvise with strips of cloth and wooden planks. The great public baths, those magnificent complexes that were among Rome's greatest architectural achievements, would become sanctuaries during these long, hot days. The baths of Caracalla, with their soaring vaulted ceilings and intricate mosaic floors, offered not just cleanliness but relief from the oppressive heat that pressed down upon the city like the hand of an irritable god. Romans would arrive in the late morning, moving slowly through the succession of rooms that led from the warm tepidarium to the hot caldarium. But it was the frigidarium, the cold room with its pool of water fed by aqueducts that brought mountain streams down from the hills, that provided the most blessed relief. Here, citizens would lower themselves into water that remained miraculously cool, even when the air outside shimmered with heat, and for a few precious moments they could forget the oppressive weight of the summer sun. In the homes of the wealthy, those fortunate enough to possess private baths and courtyards with their own fountains, the rhythm of summer days followed a different pattern, though no less governed by the relentless heat. The atrium, that central courtyard that formed the heart of every proper Roman house, would become a study in the movement of shadows as the sun traced its path across the sky. The compluvium, the opening in the roof that allowed rainwater to collect in the impluvium below, also served as a passage for whatever breeze might stir the stagnant air, though during the height of summer, even these architectural features designed to cool the home seemed to invite the heat inside, like an unwelcome guest who would not leave. The wealthy matrons would retreat to their private chambers, where slaves would fan them with large feathers or palm fronds, the gentle movement creating the illusion of coolness, even when the air itself remained thick and warm. These women, draped in the finest linen that could be procured from Egypt, would recline on couches positioned to catch whatever hint of breeze might drift through the carefully positioned windows, their jewelry removed and stored away because even gold and silver became uncomfortably warm against the skin. They would sip wine mixed with snow that had been preserved in deep underground chambers, a luxury so precious that it was reserved for only the most oppressive days, when the heat seemed to press against the very walls of their homes like a living thing seeking entry. The slaves who served these households faced a different kind of summer altogether, one where the heat was not merely an inconvenience to be avoided, but a constant companion in their daily labors. In the kitchen, where fires had to be maintained for cooking, regardless of the temperature outside, the heat would build throughout the day until the very air seemed to shimmer with intensity. The cooks would rise before dawn to prepare the elaborate meals that Roman society demanded, working by the light of oil lamps to knead bread, prepare sauces, and roast meats before the sun could turn their workplace into something resembling the mouth of Vulcan Forge. Even so, by midday, the kitchen would become nearly unbearable, and the wise cook would prepare only cold dishes. foods that required no additional heat to add to the already oppressive atmosphere. Out in the streets, where the common people of Rome conducted their daily business, the summer heat created a world that moved like a dream, where every action required conscious effort, and where the simple act of walking from one place to another became a meditation on endurance. The cobblestones, worn smooth by countless feet and cartwheels, would become too hot to touch with bare hands, radiating heat that could be felt through the thickest sandals. The narrow streets between the towering insulae would trap the warm air like canyons, creating corridors where the heat seemed to echo back and forth between the walls, growing more intense with each reflection. The vendors who sold their wares in these streets would seek whatever shade they could find, stretching pieces of cloth between buildings or positioning themselves under the overhanging upper floors of the apartment buildings. Their voices calling out descriptions of fresh bread, ripe fruit, or cool water would take on a different quality in the heat, becoming slower and more melodious, as if the very air was too thick to carry sharp sounds. The customers who came to buy would move with deliberate slowness, conserving their energy for the essential tasks of life, their conversations brief and focused, their movements economical in the way of people who understood that every unnecessary gesture was a small rebellion against the oppressive weight of the summer sun. Children, those small beings who in cooler weather would run and play with boundless energy, would discover new games suited to the languid pace of summer. They would seek out the coolest spots in their neighborhoods, the deep shadows cast by temples and public buildings, the areas near public fountains where the sound of water created at least the illusion of coolness. Their games would become quieter, more contemplative, involving the arrangement of stones or the drawing of pictures in the dust, activities that required thought rather than vigorous movement. Even their laughter would take on a different quality, softer and more measured, as if they instinctively understood that the summer heat demanded a different kind of childhood, one that moved at the pace of honey rather than the quick silver energy of spring. The workshops where artisans practiced their trades would become places of particular challenge during the summer months. The blacksmiths, whose forges had to burn regardless of the weather, would begin their work in the deepest part of the night, when the air was coolest and their hammering would not disturb the sleep of their neighborhoods. By dawn, they would have completed the most demanding parts of their craft, shaping iron and bronze, while the heat of their forges was the only source of warmth in the cooling air. As the sun rose and the day began to heat up, they would shift to tasks that required no additional fire, the polishing and finishing work that could be done in the relative coolness of shade. The potters would find their clay drying too quickly in the intense heat, cracking before it could be properly shaped, forcing them to work in the early morning hours when the air still held some moisture from the night. They would cover their work with damp cloths, creating small environments of humidity in the dry air, and learn to work with quick, sure movements that took advantage of the brief moments when their materials remained workable. The heat would become both enemy and ally, drying their finished pieces with remarkable speed, but also threatening to destroy their work if they did not time their efforts perfectly. In the great public spaces of Rome, the heat would transform the familiar landmarks into something almost dreamlike in their stillness. The Forum Romanum, usually bustling with activity from dawn to dusk, would take on a different character during the hottest part of the day. The marble columns would become too hot to touch, radiating heat that created shimmering curtains of warm air that made the inscriptions on monuments appear to dance and waver. The senators and magistrates who conducted the business of the empire would adjust their schedules to avoid the worst of the heat, meeting in the cool of the morning or waiting for the slightly less oppressive heat of late afternoon. The great theaters and amphitheaters would require special consideration during the summer months. The stone seats would become too hot for comfort, forcing the organizers of games and spectacles to install elaborate systems of awnings and shade cloths. The Colosseum, that magnificent arena where gladiators fought for the entertainment of the masses, would employ teams of sailors from the imperial fleet to operate the velarium, a massive canvas covering that could be deployed to provide shade for the spectators. Even with these measures, the summer games would take on a different character, with shorter events and longer intervals between contests, allowing both performers and audience to rest in whatever shade could be provided. The gardens of Rome, those carefully cultivated spaces that provided respite from the stone and marble of the urban landscape, would undergo their own transformation during the long summer months. The wealthy Romans who could afford elaborate pleasure gardens would watch as their carefully planned landscapes adapted to the heat, with a wisdom that seemed almost human in its deliberate slowness. The gardeners, those skilled slaves and freedmen who understood the secrets of coaxing beauty from the earth, would rise before dawn to tend their charges, working by the pale light of oil lamps to water the delicate flowers and trim the herbs that would wilt under the direct attention of the summer sun. In these private sanctuaries, the sound of water would become more precious than music, more soothing than the finest poetry recited in the cool halls of libraries. Fountains that in spring had been merely decorative would become essential sources of relief, their gentle splashing creating zones of slightly cooler air, where the evaporation provided a hint of the refreshment that the human soul craved during these oppressive days. The wealthy owners would position their couches and dining areas near these water features, understanding instinctively that the sound alone could provide psychological relief even when the actual temperature remained unchanged. The plants themselves would demonstrate a kind of ancient wisdom in their response to the heat, closing their leaves during the harshest part of the day and opening them again only when the angle of the sun suggested that the worst had passed. The olive trees, those silver-leafed companions that had sustained Mediterranean civilization for countless generations, would seem to shimmer in the heat, their leaves turning to catch whatever breeze might stir the still air. The grapevines, heavy with fruit that was slowly sweetening under the relentless sun, would droop their leaves to create their own shade, protecting the precious clusters that would eventually become the wine that Romans considered as essential. As bread, the aqueducts that brought fresh water down from the mountains to feed the great city would become lifelines during these summer months, their steady flow representing a connection to the cool heights where still lingered even in the heat of July and August. The engineers who maintained these marvels of Roman ingenuity would work primarily during the coolest hours of the day, inspecting the channels and cleaning the settling tanks that ensured the water remained pure during its long journey from source to city. They understood that any interruption in this flow would transform the summer heat from mere discomfort into genuine danger for the million people who depended on this mountain water for survival. Along the banks of the Tiber, that muddy river that wound through the heart of Rome like a sluggish brown serpent, the heat would create its own microclimate of humidity and stagnant air. The bargemen who transported goods up and down the river would adapt their schedules to move during the night, when the air above the water was marginally cooler, and when the absence of the sun eliminated the blinding glare that reflected off the water's surface like polished bronze. During the day, these men would seek shelter under makeshift awnings on their boats, or in the taverns that lined the riverbank, establishments that stayed relatively cool due to their thick stone walls and proximity to the water. The public fountains, scattered throughout the city, would become gathering places where social distinctions seemed to blur under the equalizing force of shared discomfort. Patricians and plebeians would wait in the same lines for their turn at the cool water, their usual concerns about social hierarchy temporarily set aside in favor of the more immediate need for relief from the heat. Children would be allowed to splash in the overflow basins, their delighted cries providing a soundtrack of joy that somehow made the heat more bearable for the adults who watched them with indulgent smiles dot in the countryside surrounding Rome, where wealthy citizens maintained their summer villas. The heat would take on a different character altogether. Here, removed from the stone and concrete that absorbed and reflected the sun energy in the city, the warmth would feel more natural, more connected to the ancient rhythms of agricultural life that had sustained humanity since the beginning of time. The villas themselves, designed by architects who understood the movement of air and the behavior of light, would be positioned to catch the slightest breeze and arranged around courtyards that created their own cooling effects through careful attention to shade and the placement of water features. The vineyards that dotted the hills around Rome would shimmer in the heat like green seas, their orderly rows creating patterns of light and shadow that changed throughout the day as the sun moved across the sky. The slaves who worked these vineyards would begin their labor before dawn, moving through the rows with practiced efficiency to complete the most demanding tasks before the heat became unbearable. They would know which slopes faced east and would receive the full force of the morning sun, and which faced west and would be tormented by the afternoon heat, timing their work to take advantage of the brief periods when each section of the vineyard remained in relative shade. The Roman villa gardens would showcase plants chosen specifically for their ability to thrive in intense heat, creating landscapes that were both beautiful and practical. Lavender would release its soothing fragrance more intensely in the heat, creating natural aromatherapy that helped visitors relax despite the oppressive temperature. Rosemary would become more pungent, its needle-like leaves designed by nature to conserve moisture while still providing the herbs that Roman cooks prized for their ability to enhance simple foods. Fig trees would provide both shade and sustenance, their broad leaves creating pools of coolness where visitors could rest while enjoying the sweet fruit that seemed to capture the essence of summer itself. The siesta, that wise institution that recognized human limitations in the face of overwhelming heat, would become a sacred part of the daily rhythm. Even the busiest merchant or the most dedicated artisan would acknowledge that there were hours when the human body simply could not function effectively in the oppressive warmth. Shops would close, workshops would fall silent, and even the great construction projects that were constantly reshaping the face of Rome would pause during the hottest part of the day. The city would take on an almost magical quality during these hours, as if it had been enchanted into a peaceful sleep by some benevolent deity who understood that rest was not laziness but wisdom. The wealthy Romans who could afford to escape the city entirely would retreat to their seaside villas along the Bay of Naples, where the proximity to the water provided at least the hope of cooling breezes. These coastal retreats would be designed around the principle of capturing and channeling whatever air movement the sea might provide, with rooms that opened onto terraces facing the water and courtyards arranged to create channels for the wind. The sound of waves against the shore would provide a constant reminder of coolness. Even when the air temperature remained uncomfortably high, life in these seaside refuges would take on a dreamy, suspended quality that seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. Meals would be served on terraces that caught the morning breeze, with foods chosen for their cooling properties rather than their richness. Fresh fish would be prepared simply, with herbs that grew wild along the coast, while fruits would be served chilled with snow that had been preserved in underground chambers. The wine would be mixed with water and served in thin glasses that stayed cool to the touch, and conversations would flow as slowly and smoothly as honey, with long pauses between thoughts that seemed natural rather than awkward in the languorous atmosphere. The Roman calendar itself would seem to slow during these summer months, as if time had become thick and viscous like warmed honey, each day stretching longer than seemed possible while paradoxically blending into the next without clear demarcation. The sundials that Romans used to mark the passage of hours would cast their shadows with painful precision, each movement of the gnomon across the marked stone serving as a reminder of how slowly the day progressed, when every moment was filled with the weight of oppressive heat. Citizens would find themselves checking these timepieces with a mixture of hope and resignation, always surprised to discover how little time had actually passed since their last glanced in the great libraries of Rome, those repositories of human knowledge where scholars gathered to read and debate. The summer heat would create an atmosphere of enforced contemplation. The thick stone walls that protected precious scrolls from fire and theft also provided some insulation from the heat, making these spaces refuges for those whose minds craved activity even when their bodies demanded rest. Readers would move more slowly among the shelves, their movements deliberate and economical, handling the papyrus scrolls with extra care, because even the oils from overheated fingers could damage the delicate writing materials. The copying of manuscripts, that essential work that preserved knowledge for future generations, would become particularly challenging during the summer months. The scribes who spent their days hunched over writing tables would find that their concentration flagged more quickly in the heat, and that the ink seemed to dry almost before their reed pens could complete each letter. They would work by the light of high windows that let in illumination while keeping out the direct rays of the sun, their movements becoming a meditation on patience as they forced themselves to maintain the steady, careful pace that accurate copying required. The Roman baths, those magnificent complexes that served as social centers as much as places of cleansing, would take on an almost sacred quality during the summer heat. The progression through the various chambers, from the changing rooms through the warm tepidarium to the hot caldarium, and finally to the blessed relief of the cold frigidarium, would become a ritual of purification and renewal that went far. beyond simple hygiene. Bathers would move through this sequence with the solemnity of pilgrims, understanding that they were participating in something that was both deeply personal and profoundly communal. The conversations that took place in these cooling chambers would have a different quality than those conducted in cooler seasons, becoming more philosophical and less concerned with the immediate pressures of daily business. Men would recline on the marble benches around the cold pools, their voices echoing softly off the vaulted ceilings as they discussed poetry and philosophy, politics and literature, their words flowing as slowly and smoothly as the water that surrounded them. The heat outside would seem like something from another world, a distant memory that could not touch them in these carefully constructed sanctuaries of coolness. The women baths, equally elaborate but separate according to Roman custom, would provide their own form of relief and social communion. Ladies would gather in the cooling chambers, their conversations ranging from family matters to the latest fashions, their voices taking on the soft, dreamy quality that heat seemed to encourage. They would anoint themselves with oils scented with cooling herbs like mint and eucalyptus, the fragrances providing psychological relief even when the physical temperature remained unchanged. The night hours, when the sun finally released its grip on the 7 hills of Rome, would bring a different kind of magic to the summer city. As the marble and stone slowly released the heat they had absorbed during the day, a gentle warmth would rise from the streets and buildings, creating currents of air that had not moved during the still daylight hours. This was when the city would come alive again, when citizens would emerge from their shelters to conduct the business and social activities that had been impossible during the oppressive daylight. The taverns and wine shops would fill with customers, seeking not just refreshment, but the company of others who had endured the same slow, heat-filled day. The wine, even when mixed with water according to Roman custom, would taste different in the summer heat, more intense and somehow more necessary, as if the sun had concentrated not just the grapes, but the very essence of relaxation and forgetfulness. Conversations would flow more freely in these establishments, lubricated not just by wine, but by the shared relief of having survived another day of summer heat. Street vendors would emerge with their torches and oil lamps, offering foods that had been prepared during the cooler morning hours and preserved throughout the day in underground storage areas where the temperature remained constant. Cold soups made from vegetables and herbs, fruits that had been kept in deep cellars, and wine that had been chilled with precious ice brought down from the mountains would become the preferred fare for those who could afford such luxuries. The prostitutes who worked the streets near the Circus Maximus and the Subura would adapt their schedules to the heat, knowing that their clients would be more interested in their services during the cooler evening hours when physical desire could overcome the lethargy that intense heat produced. They would perfume themselves with oils that were believed to have cooling properties and dress in the lightest fabrics available, understanding that their profession required them to remain attractive even when the heat made everyone else look wilted and exhausted. The religious observances that were such an important part of Roman life would also adapt to the summer heat, with ceremonies moved at the earliest hours of the morning or the latest hours of the evening, when the temples would not feel like ovens. Priests would don their ceremonial robes only for the briefest time necessary to perform the required rituals, and offerings of food would be chosen for their ability. to remain fresh in the heat rather than for their richness or complexity. Great festivals that normally brought the entire city together would be modified to accommodate the oppressive weather, with processions shortened and outdoor events moved to whatever shade could be provided by temporary awnings and structures. The participants in these celebrations would move more slowly, their usual exuberance tempered by the understanding that excessive enthusiasm could lead to exhaustion or worse in the brutal heat. In the underground areas of the city, the sewers, and storage areas that formed the hidden infrastructure of Roman civilization, the temperature would remain more constant, creating refuges for those who knew how to access them. Slaves and servants would sometimes steal moments of relief in these cooler spaces, and even some citizens would find excuses to visit the underground areas where wine and grain were stored, understanding that a few minutes in these naturally air-conditioned spaces could provide hours of renewed energy. The cemeteries and burial grounds outside the city walls would take on an eerily peaceful quality during the summer heat, as if the dead had found the ultimate escape from the oppressive weather that tormented the living. Mourners would visit these places during the coolest parts of the day, bringing offerings of water and cool fruits that seemed appropriate for souls who no longer needed to endure the discomforts of physical existence. The soldiers stationed in and around Rome would find their military routines transformed by the summer heat, their usual rigid discipline necessarily adapted to accommodate the physical limitations that extreme temperatures imposed on even the most hardened veterans. The legendary Roman legions, renowned throughout the known world for their ability to march 20 miles a day in full armor, would adjust their training schedules to the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, understanding that valor and endurance had their limits when confronted with the relentless Mediterranean sun. Their bronze and leather armor, normally worn with pride as symbols of Roman might, would become instruments of torture in the heat, requiring special care and timing to prevent the metal from becoming too hot to touch. Against human skin, the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers responsible for protecting the emperor and maintaining order in the capital, would develop their own strategies for coping with the summer heat while maintaining their vigilance. Their barracks, constructed with thick stone walls and positioned to catch whatever breeze might stir the air, would become refuges during the hottest parts of the day. The guards would learn to move with economy and precision, conserving their energy for moments when action might be required, their usual martial bearing softened by the universal human need to find relief from the oppressive warmth that made every piece of equipment feel heavier than usual. Military exercises and training would take on a different character during these summer months, becoming more focused on strategy and tactics rather than physical endurance. Officers would gather in shaded courtyards to discuss the finer points of battlefield maneuvers, their conversations punctuated by frequent pauses to drink water and seek whatever cooling breeze might be available. The centurions, those backbone leaders of the Roman military system, would demonstrate their wisdom by understanding that maintaining the health and morale of their men during the summer heat was as important as any tactical consideration. The great amphitheaters outside Rome, where gladiators trained for their deadly performances, would become places of particular challenge during the summer months. The gladiator schools, with their combinations of barracks, training areas, and medical facilities, would operate on modified schedules that acknowledge the dangerous relationship between intense physical exertion and oppressive heat. Training would begin before dawn, when the sand of the practice arenas was still cool enough to provide secure footing, and would end before the sun reached its full strength, leaving the afternoon hours for rest and recovery in whatever shade could be found. The gladiators themselves, those men who faced death for the entertainment of Rome's citizens, would develop an intimate understanding of how heat affected their bodies and their performance. They would learn to hydrate carefully, drinking water mixed with honey and herbs. That helped replace the salts lost through constant perspiration. Their trainers, many of whom were former gladiators who had earned their freedom through skill and survival, would pass on the hard-won knowledge of how to maintain strength and reflexes, even when the body wanted nothing more than to seek shade and rest. The wild animals kept for the beast hunts and exotic displays would require special care during the summer heat, their handlers understanding that creatures from the forests of Germania or the mountains of Atlas were not adapted to the intense Mediterranean sun. These valuable animals, representing enormous investments in capture, transport, and maintenance, would be housed in specially constructed facilities with thick walls and water features designed to keep them healthy and presentable for the crowds that expected spectacular entertainment. Regardless of the weather dot in the workshops where armor and weapons were forged and maintained, the summer heat would create working conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The blacksmiths who worked with the tools of war would begin their most demanding tasks in the darkness before dawn, racing against the rising sun to complete work that required the hottest fires. The sound of hammers on anvils would ring out through the pre-dawn streets, a rhythmic music that spoke of craftsmen who understood that timing was everything when it came to working with fire and metal during the summer months. The medical facilities associated with military installations would see different types of injuries and illnesses during the summer heat, with physicians learning to recognize and treat the effects of prolonged exposure to high temperatures. These military doctors, many of whom had gained their experience treating soldiers in the far reaches of the empire, would develop specialized knowledge of how to maintain fighting readiness in climates that challenged the human body capacity for sustained physical activity. The horses and mules that were essential to Roman military operations would require special attention during the summer months, their handlers understanding that these animals were as vulnerable to heat stress as their human companions. Stables would be positioned to catch whatever breeze was available, and feeding schedules would be adjusted to provide the animals with the energy they needed without overtaxing their systems during the hottest parts of the day. The cavalry units, those mobile forces that gave Roman armies their tactical flexibility, would plan their exercises and movements around the daily rhythm of heat and relative coolness. Transport and supply operations would slow to accommodate the summer heat, with wagon trains and pack animals moving during the cooler hours and seeking shelter during the peak heat of midday. The roads that connected Rome to its far-flung provinces would see reduced traffic during the summer months, as merchants and military commanders alike understood that goods and people could be lost to the heat if proper precautions were not taken. Rest stops and way stations would become more important than usual, their shade and water sources representing the difference between successful journeys and dangerous delays. the great construction projects that were constantly changing the face of Rome would adapt their schedules to the summer heat, with architects and engineers understanding that both human workers and building materials had their limitations when temperatures soared. Stone masons would work during the early morning hours when the marble and travertine were still cool enough to handle safely, while the mixing of mortar and concrete would be timed to prevent the materials from setting too quickly in the heat. Before they could be properly applied, the aqueduct maintenance crews, those unsung heroes who kept the water flowing to Rome's million inhabitants, would face particular challenges during the summer heat. Their work required them to spend long hours in the sun, inspecting and cleaning the channels that brought mountain water down to the city. But they understood that any failure in the water system during the hot months could have catastrophic consequences for the urban population. They would work in rotating shifts, with teams taking over for each other at regular intervals to prevent heat exhaustion among workers whose skills were essential to the survival of the city. The stone quarries outside Rome, where the marble and travertine for public buildings were extracted, would operate on drastically reduced schedules during the summer months. The quarry workers, many of whom were slaves or condemned criminals, would begin their dangerous work in the darkness. Before dawn, racing to extract and move stone before the sun turned the quarry into a furnace where human survival became doubtful. The overseers would learn to balance the need for building materials against the very real risk of losing workers to heat stroke and exhaustion. The temples of Rome, those magnificent structures dedicated to the gods who watched over the eternal city, would take on an almost mystical quality during the summer heat, as if the oppressive warmth had transformed them into gateways between the mortal world and the divine realm where such earthly discomforts held no power. The priests who tended these sacred spaces would adapt their rituals to accommodate the heat, understanding that devotion required wisdom as much as faith, and that the gods would surely understand the need to modify ceremonies when human endurance reached its limits under the relentless Mediterranean sun. Dot and the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, crowning the Capitoline Hill like a marble jewel set against the bronze sky. The morning rituals would begin before dawn, when the massive columns still held a whisper of coolness from the night air. The priests would move through their sacred duties with deliberate grace, their white robes chosen not just for their symbolic purity, but for their ability to reflect the heat that would soon make any dark clothing unbearable. The incense that normally filled the temple with fragrant smoke would be used more sparingly during the summer months, as the additional heat from burning herbs and resins could make the already warm interior feel like the mouth of a furnace. The smaller neighborhood temples, those intimate shrines where ordinary citizens came to make their daily offerings and seek the favor of household gods, would become refuges of coolness and contemplation during the long summer days. These sacred spaces, built with thick stone walls and designed to remain dim and cool, would offer psychological relief as much as physical comfort to worshippers who found the heat almost overwhelming. Citizens would linger longer than usual in these temples, their prayers taking on a more meditative quality as they savored the relative coolness and the sense of connection to powers greater than the oppressive weather. The Vestal Virgins, those sacred guardians of Rome's eternal flame, would face unique challenges during the summer heat, as their duties required them to maintain the sacred fire regardless of the temperature outside. These women, chosen from noble families to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years, would develop careful strategies for tending the flame without adding unnecessary heat to their already warm temple. They would use the finest, driest wood that burned cleanly with minimal smoke, and would time their duties to coincide with the cooler parts of the day whenever possible, understanding that their sacred responsibilities required them to be as wise as they were devout. The Roman calendar was filled with religious festivals and observances, many of which would require modification during the summer months to prevent the heat from overwhelming participants and spectators alike. The great processions that normally wound through the streets of Rome, featuring elaborate floats, costumed participants, and musicians, would be shortened and rescheduled to take advantage of the cooler morning hours. The festival organizers would provide shaded areas and water stations along the route, understanding that public celebration needed to balance spectacle with the basic human need for survival in extreme heat. The practice of augury, that ancient Roman art of reading the will of the gods through the observation of birds and natural signs, would take on different characteristics during the summer heat. The augurs, those skilled practitioners who interpreted divine messages for the guidance of the state, would find that birds behaved differently in the extreme heat, flying at different times and altitudes, seeking shade and water rather than following their usual patterns. This would require the augurs to develop new interpretations and understanding, adapting their ancient knowledge to the reality of summer conditions while maintaining the sacred traditions that guided Roman decision-making in the sacred groves. Outside the city, where Romans went to commune with nature spirits and forest deities, the summer heat would create an atmosphere of hushed reverence, as if the very air had become thick with divine presence. These natural temples, with their ancient oak and pine trees providing whatever shade could be found, would become gathering places for those seeking spiritual solace from the oppressive heat. The priests and priestesses who tended these outdoor shrines would learn to work with the rhythm of the summer sun, conducting ceremonies during the brief cool of dawn or the longer shadows of evening. The mystery religions that attracted many, Romans seeking deeper spiritual experiences, would adapt their initiation ceremonies and sacred rituals to the summer heat, understanding that extreme temperatures could either enhance or dangerously compromise the intense psychological experiences that these religions promised. The underground temples where some of these ceremonies took place would provide natural cooling, their stone chambers maintaining temperatures that made extended religious experiences possible even during the hottest months. The Roman tradition of household worship, where families maintained shrines to their ancestral spirits and protective deities, would take on increased importance during the summer heat, as these intimate religious practices could be conducted in the relative coolness of private homes. The daily offerings of food and wine to family gods would be chosen for their ability to remain fresh in the heat, while the prayers and ceremonies would often be timed to coincide with the brief respite that evening brought to overheated households. The sacred springs and wells that dotted the Roman landscape would become places of pilgrimage during the summer months, their cool waters taking on almost miraculous properties in the minds of citizens desperate for relief from the heat. These natural water sources, many of which had been sacred to local deities long before Rome rose to power, would attract visitors who came seeking not just physical refreshment, but spiritual renewal. The priests who tended these water shrines would find their services in greater demand during the summer as people sought blessings and healing from deities associated with cool, life-giving water. The Roman practice of dream interpretation, where citizens sought guidance from gods who spoke through sleep visions, would be affected by the summer heat as the oppressive temperatures made restful sleep difficult and often produced fevered dreams that required careful interpretation. The professional dream interpreters who offered their services in the markets and temple precincts would develop specialized knowledge of how heat affected sleep patterns and dream content, understanding that summer visions might carry different meanings than those received during cooler seasons. The burial customs and funeral rites that were such an important part of Roman religious life would require significant modification during the summer heat, as the combination of high temperatures and the natural processes of death created practical challenges that had to be addressed while still maintaining the dignity and proper observance that Roman society demanded. Funerals would be conducted during the coolest parts of the day, with shorter processions and abbreviated ceremonies that still honored the deceased while protecting the living from heat. Exhaustion taught the Roman practice of consulting oracles and seeking prophetic guidance would take on different characteristics during the summer months, as the sacred sites where these consultations took place would need to accommodate both the physical reality of extreme heat and the spiritual requirements of divine communication. The Sibylline books, those ancient prophetic texts consulted in times of crisis, would be examined in cool, underground chambers where the sacred scrolls could be protected from both heat and humidity that might damage the precious writings. The seasonal religious observances that marked the Roman agricultural calendar would reflect the reality of summer heat, with ceremonies celebrating the harvest and honoring agricultural deities scheduled to coincide with the times when farmers and their families could safely gather in large groups. These festivals would feature prayers for cooling rains and successful preservation of grain and other crops that needed to survive the hot months before autumn brought relief. The Roman understanding of medicine and health would undergo subtle but important shifts during the summer months as physicians and healers adapted their knowledge to address the specific challenges that extreme heat brought to human well-being. The great medical schools that trained doctors for service throughout the empire would emphasize the importance of understanding how heat affected the four humors that Romans believed governed health, teaching that summer required different approaches to maintaining the balance between hot, cold, wet, and dry elements within the human body. The physicians who served wealthy Roman families would adjust their prescriptions and treatments to account for the oppressive summer heat, recommending foods and beverages that were believed to have cooling properties, and advising their patients to avoid activities that might generate excess heat within the body. These learned men, many of whom had studied in the great medical centers of Alexandria or Athens, would draw upon centuries of accumulated wisdom about living in hot climates, adapting Greek and Egyptian knowledge to the specific conditions of Roman summers. The public health measures that kept Rome functioning as a city of over 1 million inhabitants would take on critical importance during the summer months, when the combination of heat, crowded living conditions, and the challenges of food preservation could create dangerous situations for public health. The aediles, those magistrates responsible for maintaining public order and safety, would increase their vigilance during the hot months, ensuring that public fountains continued to flow. That waste removal continued despite the unpleasant conditions, and that food vendors maintained proper standards even when the heat made preservation difficult. The Roman tradition of therapeutic bathing would reach its peak importance during the summer heat, as citizens understood instinctively that immersion in cool water was not just pleasant, but essential for maintaining health during the oppressive months. The great bath complexes would develop sophisticated systems for maintaining water at different temperatures, allowing bathers to progress gradually from hot to warm to cool water, creating a therapeutic experience that helped the body adapt to the extreme external temperatures. The use of herbs and natural remedies would shift during the summer months, with Roman healers recommending plants and preparations that were believed to have cooling effects on the body. Mint and cucumber would be prescribed, not just for their pleasant taste, but for their supposed ability to reduce internal heat, while certain oils and unguents would be applied to the skin to provide relief from the burning effects of prolonged sun exposure. The herb gardens maintained by wealthy households would be carefully tended to ensure a supply of these cooling remedies throughout the hot season. The Roman fascination with astrology and the influence of celestial bodies on human affairs would take on new dimensions during the summer heat, as astrologers would interpret the position of the sun and stars as explanations for the oppressive conditions that made life so challenging. These learned practitioners would advise their clients about the best times for various activities based not just on the traditional astrological calculations, but on the practical understanding that certain hours of the day were simply too hot for normal human activity. The dietary customs of Rome would undergo seasonal modifications during the summer heat, with cooks and food preparers developing menus that took into account both the challenges of food preservation in high temperatures and the human body. Reduced appetite during oppressive weather. Meals would become lighter and simpler, featuring more fruits and vegetables and less of the heavy meats and rich sauces that were popular during cooler months. Cold dishes would become more elaborate and sophisticated as cooks discovered ways to create satisfying meals that did not require heating or additional cooking during the hottest parts of the day. The wine culture that was so central to Roman social life would adapt to summer conditions, with vintners and wine merchants developing techniques for keeping their products cool and palatable even during the most oppressive heat. Underground storage areas would become more important, and the practice of mixing wine with water would take on new significance as a way of creating refreshing beverages that provided both hydration and the social lubrication that Roman culture valued. Ice, when available, would be reserved for the most important occasions, and the wealthy would compete to offer their guests the coolest and most refreshing drinks possible. The Roman appreciation for literature and poetry would find new expression during the summer heat, as writers and poets discovered that the enforced slowness of hot weather created opportunities for contemplation and creativity that were not available during the busier, cooler months. The themes of summer poetry would often focus on the longing for coolness, the beauty of shaded gardens, and the philosophical acceptance of natural forces that were beyond human control. Reading would become a preferred activity during the hottest hours, as books could be enjoyed in whatever shade was available, while more physical activities became impossible. The Roman educational system would adjust to summer conditions, with teachers and students understanding that learning required different approaches when concentration was challenged by oppressive heat. Schools would begin their sessions earlier in the morning and extend breaks during the hottest parts of the day, creating schedules that worked with rather than against the natural rhythm that summer imposed on human activity. The great libraries would become refuges for students and scholars, their thick walls and cool interiors providing environments where intellectual work could continue even when outdoor temperatures made normal activity difficult. The Roman legal system would accommodate summer heat and its procedures and schedules, with courts and tribunals understanding that justice required clear thinking and careful attention to detail, qualities that could be compromised by extreme temperatures. Legal proceedings would be scheduled for the cooler hours of the day, and the great basilicas where trials took place would be chosen partly for their ability to provide relief from the heat. Lawyers and judges would dress in lighter clothing and take more frequent breaks, acknowledging that even the most important legal matters needed to be adjusted to human limitations. The Roman tradition of public oratory and political speech would adapt to summer conditions, with speakers learning to modify their delivery style and timing to account for audiences that might be less attentive and more easily fatigued in oppressive heat. The great forums where political debates took place would see shorter speeches and more frequent intervals, as even the most skilled orators understood that their effectiveness depended on their ability to hold attention despite the distracting effects of extreme temperature. As our journey through a Roman summer draws to its close, let yourself imagine the gradual approach of evening, that blessed time when the sun would finally begin its descent toward the western hills, and the first hints of cooling air would stir the leaves of the olive trees that dotted the Roman landscape. Feel the sense of relief that would wash over the city as shadows began to lengthen and the oppressive weight of the heat started to lift, like a heavy blanket being slowly pulled away from overheated skin. Let your breathing slow and deepen as you picture the Romans of centuries past, finally able to venture from their shelters and refuges, their faces turned gratefully toward the first cooling breezes that promised eventual relief from their slow, sweaty ordeal. And now, as the ancient Roman day comes to its peaceful end, let yourself drift into that same restful state that our ancestors found when the heat finally released its grip and the cool darkness of night offered its gentle embrace. Feel your own body relaxing completely, your muscles releasing all tension as you sink deeper into comfort, your mind letting go of all concerns as you follow the example of those Romans who learned that sometimes the greatest wisdom lies in simply surrendering to rest, in accepting that there are forces larger than ourselves, and in finding peace in the quiet moments when the world finally grows still and cool. Let sleep come to you as naturally as night came to Rome, bringing with it the deep, restorative rest that you have earned, just as those ancient people earned their peaceful slumber after enduring their long, slow, sweaty summer days. Sleep well, and let your dreams be filled with cool breezes, gentle shade, and the timeless peace that comes to all who learn to find rest even in the midst of life's greatest challenges.